Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, episode 22. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful, viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all of our interviews on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. You can always access our podcasts at thefederalnewswire.com. My guest today is Ambassador Andrew Bremberg. Andrew is the president of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. He previously served as representative of the United States to the Office of the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva. He was also assistant to the president and director of the Domestic Policy Council for the Executive Office of the President, and in Congress as a policy advisor and counsel on nominations for the Office of Senate Majority Leader. Andrew, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in. I talked a little bit in our pre-show, as we like to do with all of our guests. We want the audience to get to know a little bit about you as a person. We doubt at sort of third grade level, when you were asked, what did you want to do when you grow up? I'm going to lead a Victims of Communism organization. So help us sort of connect the dots about how you went through your journey in life to get into kind of the politics and policy lane before you ended up going into service in Congress.
Yeah, well, thanks, Steve. It's great to be with you today. And that's a great question. I certainly can guarantee when I was in third grade, I never imagined I'd be doing half the things I've ended up doing in my life. I was born in New York City. I grew up in northern New Jersey. Pretty kind of typical American life growing up in the 1980s, where it was morning in America.
Yeah.
I grew up and came of age during, the Ronald Reagan, presidency, where we were proud to be Americans, and our own domestic issues, were challenging, but we're kind of being turned around, and we faced an existential threat of communism. And President Reagan's leadership, and then after he left office, communism collapsed. It was gone. I'm sure you can remember going through that experience as a younger person. I was still a kid. I had no concept of what that meant, but every adult I knew was crying tears of joy. This kind of miraculous thing that they couldn't have ever imagined having happened had happened. So that was a big informative part of my growing up. I'd grown up in a family that supported President Reagan. I am also Catholic. So I had grown up at a time where the Pope, who was, a Pope from Poland, from behind the Iron Curtain, had preached and evangelized a lot about the evils of communism. And so what I saw, as a kid, was that fight had been won and was over and was now in the past. And as I grew older and through high school and college, where I got interested in public policy and public service, what was clear to me was that, okay, the existential external threat of communism had been defeated, and that the challenges that that would come to the American way of life, to preserving our freedoms and liberties, were not external, and would basically be mostly internal. The whole kind of age-old question of going back to our founders, like what type of government have you given us? A republic, if you can keep it, and the normal part of the American challenge of self-governance, right? That it's you, the population, through education and enculturation and handing down traditions and responsibility over generations, you have the government, and you get the government that you choose, right? And you have to nurture that, and that would be the challenge. So when it came to public policy, I started focusing on domestic issues. I expected that the biggest threats to our sense of kind of freedom and liberty would come from our own domestic regulatory decisions. So I'd worked in healthcare. I worked at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services throughout the entirety of the Bush administration, worked on healthcare issues, and had learned a lot about how the domestic regulatory state works, for better and for ill. And as you mentioned, that resulted in me leading the White House Domestic Policy Council for the first 2 years of the Trump administration. And, that was an incredible honor to serve. I was deeply proud of much of our record. of what we were able to accomplish, particularly on the deregulatory policies and protecting Americans' freedoms and values. So that was much of that experience growing up, and that's what brought me to that point in my career.
Well, it is interesting arc for a lot of us to have grown up thinking of communism and the Soviet Union as synonymous. It was a
Right.
little bit of a magician's trick that from the 70s forward, a lot of the mainstream foreign policy establishment in our country really carved China off in a different category. It wasn't like the Soviet Union, and it was going to become something different. It was not seen as the part of the problem. It was seen as part of a solution, potentially.
That's right.
And as we now know, looking back now that we are older, wiser, and have consumed experience in the intervening years, what we were led to believe wasn't necessarily so. And so now you spoke very compellingly and accurately about what we lived through, thinking the end of history had arrived.
Exactly.
And yet, here we are today, and there is a major nation led by a communist party that's presenting challenges in your safe turf of domestic policy in the United States. And so, but before we jump into the substance of that stuff, and I do want to churn a little bit in those areas, I also want to share with the audience something that not everyone gets to experience and not everyone values, but you did spend some time and toil and sacrifice on the wonderful project known as a party platform. Now, I was a party chairman, as everyone in our audience knows. It is probably among the most thankless jobs anyone can ever have in all
Certainly.
of politics. And when it comes to platforms, there are lots of people who say, well, we have to follow a platform. But if you did a test of how many people had read said platform, that's kind of a harsh reality. But you and I and several other friends toiled for some time. You got the extended toil to coordinate well in advance of convention and going through all that process. But talk a little bit about what you saw as kind of the value of having a document like that, what the potential for that is, whether it's the Republican platform or the Democratic platform, but the importance of what a platform potentially is, because I think it's kind of relevant to what we are making by way of declaratory policy. But there you go, back to 2016.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, I've been asked to serve as the policy director for the development of the Republican Party's platform for the 2016 convention. And I of course was very familiar with party platforms before then, but had never worked on it up close. And really, to me, was a great shining example of the kind of civic organizations or different civic levels within our democracy of parties that elect and select delegates to a convention that are going to put forward, that you obviously nobly served as, and are going to come together. These are not individuals that are all in Washington. These are people that come from all across the country to represent their communities within a party, to say and really argue and discuss and say, this are the principles. This is what our political party stands for in that instance. As you know, and many of our viewers may know, party platforms change over time, and it's amazing to watch the evolution.
We made some news changing a few things at that convention.
That's right, and it's amazing to see. This is a part of our kind of our basic democracy, that we have our two major parties that they sit down every 4 years ish, and hash out what are the values they're presenting that they want to kind of rally behind and what they want to put forward to the American people. So it was a really great glimpse outside of my traditional kind of public policy work. I'd gone to law school. I worked on regulatory issues in much more of a kind of idealist communication perspective of what are the things the party wants to stand for. So in my role, I had the opportunity to kind of serve as trying to help corral people together and provide, a working draft for the delegates, having listened to hundreds and hundreds of people representing different parts from across the kind of political spectrum, to put forward language that delegates could work off of, file amendments on, vote on, amend, rewrite, and change, and see all that come together. So that was quite a ringside seat to, small parts of our democratic process.
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree completely about the value of the experience. I think on substance and on process, it gives an added context and texture to what we as Americans believe in, what we in particular parties believe in, that gets beyond what will ever make it through the news media. It gets beyond whatever is in an international relations or political science textbook, and gets beyond what most people would really think or know about, even if they'd served in the foreign service or the military or other laudable things. It was a really valuable thing to participate in and observe. And now I would say that the 5 years I served in the White House many moons ago, I didn't begin or end any meetings citing the platform of the party. And so that is one of those things that it had its function and role, but it didn't necessarily translate into a governing document for a White House or an agency of government. Some people in the grassroots of the party might sweat that a little bit, but that's just the reality of what it was. But it still did have that expression, and any of us that were affected by it surely would have been thinking about some of those processes as we go through. But let's shift then into you had a pretty interesting front row seat to things in a White House that was at a time of transition in dealing with China, among other areas. Trade is an area that kind of is a connective tissue between international affairs and domestic policy. Obviously, has a big impact in both realms, so you no doubt had some observations about what it's like to come into a new administration, what's easy or hard to get things started, implementing policy. I think some of your observations about what that was like, it doesn't even have to be specific to the Trump White House, but just going through that, not every American gets to do that. And even fewer people out in the world have the reality check of what that is. And so as we anticipate a 2025 where there's continuity or change in America, we're going to again go through people coming into these jobs thinking, I've been elected and we're going to do these things. And what were some of your key takeaways and what the lessons learned on trying to do that?
Well, I break that down into a kind of couple pieces. One, just about the nature of transitions in general, and two, what does that look like as you transition into governing? And we can come back to kind of how I transitioned from focusing on domestic policy work into the focus on China and the Chinese Communist Party today.
We'll get there. That's how you got the illustrious title of ambassador.
That's right. So, but just looking at the transition, this is something our government's looked at and tried and made several changes to legally in the last couple of years. I think there's more work to do in this space. If you think of the size and scope of the federal government and all the policies that that need to be implemented and the scope of its regulatory reach and everything it tries to do, and you say we're going to take not just the CEO but the kind of CEO and entire management team and remove them, and you're going to have a short 2-month window where that transition takes place with a new CEO and a new senior management team, although that new senior management team is only going to show up over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. Transitions are incredible, and that I think more attention. I applaud the work that's been done in the past to start transitions earlier in the process, even before the election. But I think that's still difficult for a number of different reasons. But I think transitions are just really important for people to focus on and pay attention to in terms of preparing the type of policy work that a new administration, for whichever party, plans to do and to implement, and really be doing the important kind of research and preparatory work to be ready for that. Because having been on several transitions and in and out of the executive branch, what you see, and this is true again of regardless of parties, what you see is so much of the policy velocity of an administration starts off very fast and slows down over time. So, for better or worse. And what I think what's critical then is to make sure that a new administration has the kind of policy and personnel support ready so that they're capable of hitting the ground running. The way our governing works with, not just, the executive branch elections every 4 years and congressional elections every 2 years, is vital important to retaining the real representative part of our democracy, but does pose challenges to being able to effectively manage or implement policies. Now, I'll take the democratic protections over, greater efficiency. I mean, I know years ago, but before people became more aware of what was happening in China, you'd see lots of writers in, American media outlets marvel at the efficiency of, the Chinese Communist
Yeah,
Party
I
and
think
what
there's
it's
some New
able to
York
do.
Times columnists that may or
Yeah,
may
yeah.
not have stepped in that.
Definitely a number of those. And so it's just one of those things that a transition is an opportunity just to look through the lens of, okay, how do we best prepare to administer policies that the American people have voted for and do so in the most kind of effective way within the guardrails of a system where we don't have an autocrat. We don't have a king. We don't have some autocratic dictator. We have representative democracy. So it's a really unique thing that I think virtually no other country really experiences, honestly, even other democratic countries, because they tend to be more parliamentary in structure. So the elections are based off of their, national representative elections, and their kind of, whether it's called cabinet secretaries or other ministers in their government, tend to come from the body of elected officials that are already in the government and somehow, but are just not in the majority. So,
and they don't have a divided government kind of situation ever.
Right. So it definitely poses as a unique challenge.
Yeah. Well, we look forward to this challenge coming again, and a lot of good people are putting spade work into thinking about it. And I think a lot has changed in the world and in the country since this was last done in earnest in 2016 on our side. 2020 transition, I think they might have had some more domestic priorities that they were focused on that front. But let's go international. You went from doing domestic policy, and not only did you get your feet deep into things international, you went to a different continent to represent the United States. Talk a little bit about two things, because I think this is an absolutely critical bridge from what you had done before to what you're doing now, and it can kind of help bring together how they go together. But going to Geneva and what kind of work is done there with what kinds of people. I mean, in my time in government, as I've said many times, a long time ago, if we did anything that was really tough on counterproliferation, it tended to be in interactions that would go through subordinate agencies that were done in Geneva. There's a lot of the functional negotiations of the U.S. government that would go through Geneva. It wasn't necessarily through the United Nations headquarters building in New York. It could be. But you lived there, you breathed it, and you had some pretty interesting experience on some top line issues, including on things China. So fill us in on what your Geneva experience was like on that.
Sure. So as you alluded to earlier, when I ran the Domestic Policy Council, my focus was domestic issues and didn't directly relate to the China challenge. But you couldn't help if you were aware of what was happening in our country, particularly in the government in 2017 and 2018. You had to know and become aware about what was going on with China. So I picked up a lot of that, to be sure. And I was looking for another opportunity to serve. Serving in the West Wing is three full-time jobs all at once. I was looking over to leave the West Wing, but still offer an opportunity to serve. And I'd grown increasingly interested from a policy perspective and concerned about how we were dealing with China and addressing the many China challenges. And also, I care about policy issues. And
Right.
I knew enough about the UN system that when people think of the UN, you normally think of New York. Right now is the kind of high level week going on in New York with UNGA right now, but most people think of New York. And as you already mentioned, so many of the UN actual kind of bureaucratic organizations are actually headquartered in Geneva or a couple in some other mostly European cities. And for those that really have no idea how it works, my kind of crude analogy is that if you compared it to how the U.S. government is structured, you'd say, the Congress and the Pentagon are in New York, the General Assembly and the Security Council, and then most of your other kind of bureaucracies and agencies are in Geneva or some other cities in Europe. So the domestic agencies that I'd worked so closely with in my role for the first 2 years, like our Department of Labor, Health and Human Services, patents, the FCC, Commerce, they're the policy leads for these agencies in Geneva, like the World Health Organization, the International Labor Union, the World Intellectual Property Organization. So I thought, okay, this will be an opportunity for me to help advance U.S. policy in these kind of more policy areas in this space, particularly with the context that Geneva has the reputation of kind of being like the workhorse versus the show horse, or the kitchen, not the dining room, the way people compared what happened in Geneva versus New York, and that you have more kind of technical policy issues come up in Geneva and be less kind of country political, like was normal to happen in the UN New York context. So that's how I kind of went into it, and was an incredible learning and eye-opening experience. Seeing firsthand the aggressive approach by the Chinese Communist Party to its approach to interacting with multilateralism and dealing with these organizations was very eye-opening. What I always say, though, that was the most kind of shocking to me was that while I kind of expected them to act in their interest, or their perceived self-interest, and advocate for their policies, what I was not prepared for was the absolute unwillingness and just willful blindness of virtually every other country in the world to just see what was happening right in front of them. That to me was the most kind of shocking part of it. I mean, again, when I went to Geneva, just from a personal perspective, if you would ask, when you leave government, what will you do? I would have told you then that I would have returned to domestic regulatory policies.
Right.
But my time there was so eye-opening to the challenge posed by the Chinese Communist Party and how aggressive they are, and how the need for the United States, but also increasingly critically other countries around the world, to really wake up to the challenge that the Chinese Communist Party faces or proposes to our way of life, our systems of governance, right now and into the future. So
you lived with a penultimate case study of exactly what you say, with the World Health Organization and COVID and the sort of elite capture, malign influences of the CCP having a real mainstream impact in America and around the world. I mean, so what happened in Geneva didn't stay in Geneva. So maybe share a little bit of what your kind of biggest takeaways were from that, because I think that is a really big and powerful case study of these international operations of the CCP. But then what you were describing of sort of the empty-headed yups from the rest of the world with grave consequences.
Yeah, where do I begin? So, and I know exactly where I'll begin, because it begins before COVID even happened. So, as you know, and many may suspect, but when you're an ambassador at kind of any post, you have a seemingly infinite list of options and invitations to speak or participate in lots of events, and you have to prioritize what those are going to be. And my staff had briefed me on a number of things, and kind of informed me of things that I wouldn't be interested in doing. Just they wanted to make sure I knew, but that they were going to have someone else take care of these. And one was, I'd been invited to speak at the WHO to commemorate the eradication of smallpox. And that they had kind of assumed I wouldn't want to do other things. I had other issues going on. And I said, no, I'm going to go speak on behalf of the United States on this critically important public health achievement, one of the most successful public health achievements, basically in human history. And speak at this. Now, this was all pre-COVID, or maybe COVID actually just popped up in China, but no one knew about it. This was December of 2019, and I sat there with the ambassador from Russia, and as well as the ambassador from the UK, because the United States, the Soviet Union at the time, and the UK had been the three countries that led the global effort to eradicate smallpox. And I felt this was almost kind of prescient in some sense, that what I focused in my remarks was that this was the need, this accomplishment, and the way this was done was the model that the WHO needed to focus on. There were already concerns that the WHO was getting involved in kind of ancillary issues that were not critical to the shared global interest around public health surveillance and communicable disease. So I used this opportunity to speak about that, the U.S. commitment to that, and why it was so important. And I stressed that using this example as a way to show this is how multilateralism or multilateral platforms can actually work. That at the height of the Cold War, when the US and the Soviet Union were no friends, we were able to work together in this environment that was non-political, that did not get involved in political elements at all, was purely technical, to cooperate and successfully eradicate, if not one of the most deadliest diseases in human history, that had killed hundreds of millions of people throughout the centuries, and eradicate smallpox. And I'd put that forward as this is the model that the WHO should use to encourage countries to work together, to maybe, at least in this space, put aside what might be real political, military, economic challenges, but in an open and technical way, cooperate on these issues.
Yeah.
And a couple of weeks later, COVID is popping up all over the place, and we realized, my God, is this about to happen? What's going on? The reason I'd gone, as I mentioned, I had served at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services throughout the Bush administration. In 2005, 2006, 2007, I'd worked on pandemic preparedness.
Yeah.
I was there when we worked to rewrite what more people are aware of now are called the International Health Regulations. These are rules that countries had negotiated inside the WHO context after the SARS disease outbreak that China had hid for months and lied about, and were specifically written to fix that problem. Right. That, again, this is at a time where we're in the early 2000s, where we're still in this kind of end of history mode. That China is still on the right side, and we really need to work with them and pull them close. We've brought them into the WTO. Sure, they're cheating, but we're not going to do anything about it yet. We just need to. I mean, you remember this time.
It was the responsible stakeholder theory.
That's exactly right, and that they were bad in this SARS case, but we just need to fix the rules better. We need to make the rules clearer, and that'll fix it, in the future. That was the intention. So we now go through COVID, and I'm the one talking with Tedros at the WHO on a constantly, seemingly daily basis about what's happening, and we are watching, unfortunately, him and other parts of the WHO Secretariat play politics.
Yeah,
I would have conversations with him where because everyone knew, I'm sure many people know this now, at the time, the United States CDC had been the model the Chinese CDC was built off of, and had very close, working level relationships. So the WHO had not been getting timely updates or complete information about the state of the epidemic in early January of 2020. And I knew the CDC wasn't getting those updates either. That had just stopped. So Tedros asked me, because I'm representing the US, he also knew I'd come from the White House, so I could kind of pick up the phone and call someone, are you guys getting this information? Because we haven't been getting it. And I said to him, I'm so glad you asked. No, we haven't been. I was going to ask you the same question. Are you getting this information? No. And we were discussing, this is a problem, and we need to encourage the Chinese to be transparent. And then Tedros personally and the WHO Secretariat come out with these statements saying, China has set the new standard in public health transparency. That was a quote. I said, that's a lie, right? I mean, and it's a lie because that you just asked me, right, of what's going. So this began the kind of really undoing, in my mind, of the real role of the WHO and its opportunity to play a non-political role. I mean, I'm sure everyone would imagine, but in every one of my conversations with Tedros at that point going forward, I made explicitly clear The United States is not asking you or the WHO to criticize China. We're asking you to stay out of the politics. Don't make praiseworthy or condemning statements. Just talk about what information you have. What information have you asked for? What information did you receive? Because what they would then do in many instances is kind of almost issue kind of like a press release style talking about, oh, we've gotten this information. That sounds good to the casual observer. But we knew they had asked for way more information and hadn't gotten it. Now, I don't think it's the role of the WHO to compel countries to do anything, right? But its role is to be an objective, technical agency that says, we've asked for this information, we've received this information. If other countries like the United States and other interested countries thought China wasn't, living up to its obligations under the international health regulations, which they weren't, it was incumbent upon them to, use diplomatic, economic, pressure the Chinese to be more compliant. But the WHO, staff basically providing political cover for the CCP to protect them from potential helpful bilateral criticism from other countries was just really stunning to see. That the level of kind of influence and fear that the WHO was now feeling versus the CCP was shocking. And this was a stark relief from 20 or almost 20 years earlier, where the Director General of the WHO during the SARS outbreak had, read the CCP, the Riot Act, over the lack of transparency. Now, of course, yes, the Chinese did provide more information in this case than they had under SARS, but woefully insufficient. And we could never get the WHO to even publicly acknowledge, to communicate what they had in fact asked of the Chinese Communist Party. That they had in fact asked them, we had asked them, lots of countries, the WHO asked China to share live virus samples in January. Lots of people paid a lot of attention to the fact that the genome sequence had been uploaded. Everyone ignored the fact that the first response by the Chinese government was to punish the scientists that had uploaded the sequence. They would later take credit for it as an act of transparency, but it had not been. But everyone wanted to get live virus samples of the original strain. They refused. The WHO asked the Chinese to do it. They never acknowledged to the world that they had asked them to do it, and the Chinese weren't going to do it. So this began a months-long process of trying to get the WHO to fulfill its core basic mission, and staying out of politics and helping countries and the world understand what was happening, what information was being provided and not. And we saw this huge influence by China and the reaction by many countries to kind of circle the wagons and kind of protect China from any sense of criticism, with the, in my mind, clearly naive belief that, well, if we criticize it all, it could be worse. They could somehow tell us less. So we should just say thank you for the little bits of information they're giving, even though they're not living up to their international obligations under the international health regulations that they had agreed to. So that was a eye-opening experience to see just at that very bureaucratic level inside Geneva, the disastrous influence of the CCP.
Well, it's painful to relive in some ways. It was probably even more painful to live as you were going through it. But it is also kind of a perfect segue to talk about the next part of your life, because what you just witnessed was the very practical consequences of communism. And there are now millions and millions, if not billions, more victims of communism because of what they did by way of political manipulations, lack of transparency, and leaving aside the either willful or accidental release of terrible toxins out into the world. But the very nature of the political system just created a whole new generation of victims, not just in China, but all over the whole world. So you go from this amazingly different experience from the West Wing into what was supposed to be an easy diplomatic tour and all these familiar subjects in a beautiful part of the world. And lo and behold, here's a pandemic and this terrible, terrible problem. Had to have just made even more concrete in your mind those thoughts from your youth and the Reagan and John Paul II times, that this threat of communism is not dead. It is still evil, and truth needs to be told, and policy and real work in the world has to be done. And you end up in a place that does exactly that. So tell us
That's
about
right.
the victims of communism, and what brought you there, and kind of what are the key pieces of this, because people would think of a
Yeah,
retrospective of the Cold War, but a lot of what you're doing now is relevant to now and the future. It's not this retrospective
absolutely.
thing.
Absolutely. Let me just wrap up that while the
Yeah.
WHO experience in Geneva was by far the most high profile, I just want you to understand the number of issues that I had to deal with across the UN bureaucracy that really dealt with China's influences
All of them.
to try to were all of them in terms of their aggression on human rights, their attempt to take over the leadership role of the World Intellectual Property Organization.
Yeah.
They're
The
cheating
greatest thief.
Americans, the greatest thief trying to take over this organization. Them cheating our shippers and domestic producers at the Universal Postal Union. Their leadership of the International Telecommunications Union, using that as an inappropriate platform to basically hawk for Huawei across the developing world. So I mean, the issues were across all these areas. So that entire experience when I left government led me to the clear conclusion that the challenge, as you just said, the challenge of communism never went away. It's back. It's here. It's front and center, and we have to do everything we can to educate Americans and those around the world about its dangers today. So that's why I was thrilled to take over a little over 2 years ago here as the president of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. VOC is actually chartered by Congress 30 years ago now, back to the end of 1993, to memorialize the more than 100 million victims who had been killed by communist regimes. Congress had passed that. That was signed by President Clinton. And the real focus of the foundation in its first 15 years was it wasn't congressionally funded. It was just called for, and it created a statue not far from the U.S. Capitol between the Senate and Union Station, a statue that serves as a physical memorial to the 100 million victims of communism. Of course, this was passed at the time that everyone thought this was past tense. We were only
Yeah.
looking in the past, right? But so VOC over the last since then, had been growing both in terms of as an education and research organization, doing more active education work about the victims of communism, particularly historically, as well as research onto the challenges and threats of communism today. And focused at a whole initiative on opening a new museum. I'm here today sitting in our museum that's 2 blocks from the White House that we just opened just last summer here at across from McPherson Square. For those of you that are in the DC area, we're right on 15th and I Street at McPherson Square, 2 blocks from the White House. So that's been the focus of the foundation. And what's been so clear to me in the last 2 years since I've been here has been how basically virtually everyone younger than me, younger than us, that didn't have that childhood experience of living at the end of the Cold War knows virtually nothing about the history of communism in the Cold War. Of course, I wasn't alive during the 30s, the 40s, or 50s, but I had learned who Joseph Stalin was.
Right.
I knew about his crimes. When I speak to young people today, particularly in high school or college, usually 10, maybe 20% even know who Joseph Stalin was. I mean, think about that. They don't even know who one of the greatest mass murderers in human history was. And what's even worse is the few that do know who he is, normally the answer I get when I ask is that he was an ally of the US in World War II. And basically, that's it.
Yeah.
And you think, wow, I mean, the fact that they don't know that, under Mao Zedong, 70 million people were killed across his time as the kind of communist dictator in both, the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward, that Stalin killed, more than 20 million people. Obviously, we've seen now with the Russia war in Ukraine, some attention paid to Ukraine, and people are starting to learn about the fact that, there was a Soviet-imposed famine, the Holodomor in the 1930s, that killed millions of Ukrainians. And of course, I've always said, while everything we do in terms of education and like museums and books and history is critically important, the most effective tools are cultural tools, TV shows, movies, songs. And so one thing we've done is develop a project called our Witness Project, where we do short form mini documentaries. These are available on our website that are 8 to 10 minutes long, that give you a personal experience of someone who's lived under communism and what they or their family have gone through. And that's a growing program of ours. We're producing more and more of those every year. And really, we've taken a really holistic approach to showing the kind of diversity of the victims of communism. So we've had individuals who were in their 80s who talk about their time under both the Nazis and the communists. And we've got younger folks that talk about fleeing Venezuela or China today. So I encourage folks to check out our Witness Project and these videos because it's a really great tool. And also I'm glad to see there's several new movies that have come out in the last several years that, I remember, I learned about, the Holocaust, of course, but I think that the two things that had the biggest impact on me growing up were reading the Diary of Anne Frank and probably watching the movie Schindler's List. Mm-hmm. Were just, really emotionally compelling stories that, hit me both as a child and as a young adult, that helped me connect, even if I didn't understand the kind of exact history yet of what had happened and exactly why. I connected it. I knew these people. So I think both kind of our Witness Project, newer films, like there was a film a couple years ago called Mr. Jones that talked about the Holodomor. It was really well done. It also showed a unique side of like the role that Western media played in covering up for Stalin and the communist dictators at the time. But also books. Kids don't read literature today about people that actually lived under communism, because these are incredible stories, again, spanning the entire last century from countries around the world, whether in Asia, Europe, Latin America, and these are really important tools that kids need to read about.
Well, there's two things that I want to try to hit on as we get into our sort of final lap. One is I just would strongly encourage anyone in the audience to dive deep into the history of the Cultural Revolution in China. There are many, many victims of that Cultural Revolution, and I trust they're among some of those witness videos that you have. We have some that pop up even in American politics now that had experiences there, but that's kind of the point. The more you learn about that Cultural Revolution, the more you'll be sensitized to the vibrations of a Cultural Revolution 2.0 that I think we're living through now. Out of China, but also in some forms of politics generally. But people think that communism is somewhere else and it's in the past or what have you. But some of these tools and experiences, whether they're struggle sessions or destructions of institutions, of family and faith and what have you. I mean, that's what John Paul II was talking about in Poland, and there's still some things happening with regard to that in China and other parts of the world. So to the extent they can dive into that Cultural Revolution experience, I think that's extremely important. Of course, the Tiananmen Square massacre is something that a younger generation might have some memory of, but even that's now sadly a lot of years ago. Right. And the Chinese government's done a lot to kind of whitewash that and memory hold it for their people and anyone else. But those are so important. But Victims of Communism did some breakthrough research work on Uyghurs. And so we don't have a ton of time left, but I'd really be remiss if I didn't have you talk a little bit about kind of what was some of the substance of that and then the impact, because it went from research into policy in a way on a topic where just a few years ago, you couldn't get any number of Americans to even know what a Uyghur was.
Right. Well, thank you. Our China program, I have to say, is bar none one of the best academic research China programs in the United States about the human rights abuses taking place in China today. It's led by Dr. Adrian Zenz, the director of our program, and he has done such incredible work. Let me talk a little bit about it. He had done his field work in originally understanding the work of the kind of poverty alleviation workforce approaches in Tibet, and then had done research over the last several years about what was happening in Xinjiang. So when the stories first started to break about the detention centers and the original kind of satellite images that first showed that there were these detentions taking place, he was publishing papers demonstrating that they were engaged in forced labor activities. Then an important paper that showed that birth prevention was a central part of the CCP's policies in Xinjiang, by forced abortion, sterilization, separating Uyghur women from their families. And then what happened last year were what we called the Xinjiang police files. So a brave hacker inside China, behind the Great Firewall, had hacked a Xinjiang police detention center of all of its information, and it sent to us tens of thousands of files that we then made available last year, including the first photos from inside the detention camps, personally identifiable and biometric information on over 750,000 individuals who had been evaluated for detention, and previously never known, undisclosed or classified speeches by senior government and party officials about what was taking place in Xinjiang. So that we published just last year, have been continuing to draw attention to. Again, I mean, this confirms for the entire world that yes, upwards of 2 million people have been detained. That no, their claim this is like a vocational education training is a lie. There are children detained here. The sheer number of elderly women in detention is just shocking and horrifying. And the impact this has had has been great. Connecting with my time in Geneva, one of my worst experiences was having to repeatedly démarche, officially communicate on behalf of the United States government to a woman by the name of Michelle Bachelet, who at the time was the High Commissioner for Human Rights in the UN system. That's your job, one job, human rights. We could not get her to allow her office to release a report on the human rights challenges taking place in Xinjiang. So I then left Geneva. I came here to VOC. We published our Xinjiang police files. We knew that the good staff in that office were going to read them and source them, and had incorporated it into their report. And finally, and this is how pathetic this is, 8 minutes before she left office, in the middle of the night, she allowed her staff to release this report, which is incredible in terms of showing the sheer scope of the human rights abuses taking place in Xinjiang. Our Xinjiang police files were the #1 resource cited as evidence of this. And this happened 1 year ago. This should have been a moment for the United States leadership and for those that talk about multilateral UN human rights leadership to stand up and demand accountability for China's human rights abuses. Unfortunately, we failed. That hasn't happened, and there's an urgent need now for the United States and other countries, if we purport to stand up and believe in human rights, we have to do something about it. And it's just unconscionable that we continue to participate in this kind of human rights charade, right, where we go after certain issues but ignore the most glaring, dangerous human rights abuse taking place on the planet today.
Well, that's going to be the exclamation point on our conversation today. Andrew, I could talk on any number of these different subjects. I feel like there's a lot we left on the table. I hope that you'll come back again another time. But for now, if people in the audience want to follow your work and commentary and that of your great organization, where best should they go?
Please come visit us, our museum, or online. Check us out at victimsofcommunism.org or on Twitter, or I guess X, VO Communism, at VO Communism, and we're across other social media platforms too. So come check us out.
I encourage everyone to do so. And for our audience, if you enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing on YouTube or on your preferred podcast platform. Thank you for joining, and a special thank you to Ambassador Andrew Bremberg for sharing his perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.